The phone rang at the office on a Tuesday morning in February 1993. The kind of call that arrives like a blade through ordinary time. Mary Johnson heard a voice on the other end asking if her son had come home the night before, saying something about the morgue, about a body, about rumors spreading through the north side of Minneapolis like smoke. Her hands went cold against the receiver. She called her sister, who called the police. And when the sister called back, her voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. Mary, they said they're coming to see you, so it must be true. The world tilted then, the fluorescent lights of the phone company office swimming in her vision, and when Mary came to, her supervisor was holding her. Though she would never remember falling, 20-year-old Laramian Bird had not come home because he could not come home. His mother's only child, her son, who carried her hopes like morning light, lay in the county morgue, with bullet wounds that had ended his life at a party that should have been nothing more than another Friday night. The detectives arrived at her sister's house with faces practiced in delivering unbearable news, and they confirmed what the phone call had already written into Mary's bones. 3 days later, they told her they had arrested the shooter, a 16-year-old boy named Ashia Israel, who had pulled a trigger over an argument so trivial it would dissolve into meaninglessness under the weight of what it cost. In that moment, standing in her sister's living room with the winter light cutting through the windows, Mary felt something dark and ancient take root in her chest where her heart used to be. She was a Christian woman, a woman who had sung hymns and believed in mercy, but now she found herself full of a hatred so pure it felt like righteousness. When she looked at Ashia Israel in the courtroom during his trial, she did not see a confused teenager who had made the worst mistake of his life. She saw an animal, something that needed to be caged, something that deserved to rot behind bars for taking her child from her. The judge charged him with second-degree murder instead of first-degree, and even that felt like betrayal, like the world was conspiring to minimize her loss. At sentencing, Mary stood to give her victim impact statement, and because she was still that Christian woman underneath all the rage, she ended by saying she forgave him, quoting scripture about forgiveness because the Bible told her to. But the words were hollow as wind through an empty house, and everyone in that courtroom, including Mary herself, knew she had not forgiven anything at all. Before we continue, leave your like, share our story, and subscribe to the channel. Thank you. Mary Johnson had grown up in the kind of neighborhood where mothers held their children close and prayed over them like amulets against the violence that prowled the streets. She had raised Laramian alone, poured everything she was into making sure he would grow up safe and strong and full of possibility. He was her only child, her morning coffee and evening prayer. The reason she got up before dawn to work at the phone company and came home tired but grateful. She had watched him grow from a boy who held her hand crossing streets into a young man of 20 with his whole life stretching out before him like an open road. On February 12th, at an after-hours party where music and ego and alcohol mixed into something combustible, that road ended in gunfire. The boy who ended it, Ashia Israel, had grown up in the same wounded neighborhoods, had learnt young that respect was currency and disrespect was a debt paid in blood. He had joined gangs early, pulled his first armed robbery at 11, collected resentments like stones in his pockets until they weighed him down into violence. At that party, when words turned heated and egos clashed, he had not stopped to think about mothers or futures, or the hole his bullets would tear in the fabric of someone else's world. He had only felt the rage, the need to prove something, and he had fired the gun. When the smoke cleared and Laramian lay dying, Ashia felt something shift inside him, but it would take years, long years behind bars, before he could name what he had lost that night beyond his freedom. Mary's days became a procession of grey mornings and sleepless nights, each one bleeding into the next like watercolors in rain. She went to work, came home, stared at Laramian's empty room, and felt the absence of him like a physical wound that would not close. She drove people away with her bitterness, snapped at friends who tried to help, turned her back on the very faith that had once sustained her. She hated Ashia Israel with a hatred that felt like fire in her blood. But she also hated everyone else, the judge who had reduced the charges, The system that called 17 years adequate payment for her son's life. The world that kept turning when hers had stopped completely. The root of bitterness went deep, tangling through her days like thorns, and she watered it with her anger, until it became the only living thing inside her. At Stillwater State Prison, Asher Israel marked time on concrete and steel. 25 years stretching ahead of him like a desert he would have to cross on his knees. For the first years, he did not let himself think about what he had done. He blamed everyone else, blamed his upbringing, blamed the party, blamed Loramian for being there, blamed the universe for the trajectory of his life. It was easier to deflect than to face the truth that he had taken a life over something so stupid, so meaningless, that he could barely remember what had sparked the argument. But prisons are places where denial eventually crumbles under the weight of time, and slowly, painfully, Asher began to examine himself. He began to see the pattern of unforgiveness in his own life, how he had collected slights and disrespect like kindling, how he had never learned to let go until it all caught fire and burned someone else's world down. The Christian woman inside Mary had not died, only buried herself deep under layers of rage, and sometimes she would surface long enough to whisper that this was not sustainable. Unforgiveness was eating her alive like cancer, hollowing her out from the inside until she was nothing but a shell walking through her days. She found herself reading a poem one afternoon, something about two mothers, one whose child had been murdered, and one whose child was the murderer, and suddenly she saw herself in both women. She saw the commonality of pain, the way suffering echoed across the distance between victim and perpetrator, mother and mother, loss and loss. In that moment, something cracked open inside her. She had a vision of an organization that would support not just mothers of murdered children, but mothers of children who had killed, because she understood now that to heal one side of that wound, you had to heal both. But to start that organization, to genuinely walk into that calling, she would need to do something impossible. She would need to truly forgive Asher Israel. Not with hollow words from a courtroom, but with a forgiveness that ran deep as her hatred had run. So 12 years after her son's death, 12 years of carrying bitterness like stones in her chest, Mary put in a request to the Minnesota Department of Corrections. She asked to visit the man who had murdered her son. When they approved her request, she felt terror and something else, something that felt almost like hope, fragile and tentative as the first light before dawn. She had never been inside a prison before. The thought of facing Asher across a table in that place made her want to turn the car around and flee back into her familiar, bitter life. But she did not turn around. When they called his name and Asher Israel walked into the visitation room, Mary felt her heart hammering against her ribs like something trying to escape. He was not the 16-year-old boy she remembered from the courtroom, the animal she had wanted caged forever. He was a man now, 33 years old, with eyes that carried the weight of what he had done, and hands that shook slightly as he sat down across from her. Mary reached out and shook his hand, and the gesture felt both absurd and sacred, a bridge thrown across an impossible distance. "I don't know you, and you don't know me," she said, her voice steady despite the earthquake happening inside her. "You didn't know my son, and he didn't know you, so we need to lay down a foundation and get to know one another." They sat in that room for 2 hours, and in that time, the silence between them began to fill with something that looked like truth. Asher told her everything. He did not make excuses or deflect or blame anyone but himself. And in his voice, Mary heard genuine remorse that ran deeper than words. He admitted what he had done, faced it without flinching. And Mary watched his face as he spoke and saw not an animal but a human being who had made a terrible mistake and had spent more than a decade learning to live with the weight of it. When he talked about her son, Loramian became real to him for the first time, not a rival at a party but a person, someone's child, someone's whole world. "He became human to me," Asher would later say, and in becoming human, Loramian's death became not just a crime but a tragedy that Asher would carry forever. For Mary, listening to this man take responsibility for destroying her life, something began to shift. The cancer of unforgiveness that had been eating her alive for 12 years began to dissolve. At the end of the meeting, when it was time for Ashia to return to his cell, Mary stood to say goodbye, and then, without planning it, without thinking about what it meant, she reached out and hugged him. She held the man who had murdered her son, held him the way she would hold her own child, and felt him crying against her shoulder. Ashia, unsure what to do, instinctively hugged her back like he would hug his own mother. When they separated, Mary walked out of that prison and got into her car, and the words kept echoing in her mind. I just hugged the man that murdered my son. But instead of horror, what she felt was freedom, vast, unexpected, overwhelming freedom. The anger that had lived in her chest for 12 years was gone. The bitterness had evaporated like morning mist under the first rays of sun. She sat in the parking lot and understood with absolute certainty that she had truly forgiven him. Not because the Bible told her to, but because God had changed her heart. The transformation was not just spiritual, but physical. Mary felt lighter, as if she had been carrying a backpack full of stones for 12 years and had finally set it down. She started sleeping better. She stopped snapping at people. The world, which had been drained of color since the night Laramian died, began to bloom again in shades she had forgotten existed. She founded From Death to Life, her organization dedicated to healing and reconciliation between families of victims and perpetrators, and she began visiting other mothers, sharing her story, showing them that the road to healing did not run around forgiveness, but straight through its center. For Ashia, receiving forgiveness from Mary was both gift and burden. He had spent years learning to face what he had done, but accepting mercy from the woman whose life he had destroyed was harder than facing punishment. Sometimes he still did not know how to hold the grace she had given him. In March of 2010, after serving 17 years of his 25-year sentence, Ashia Israel was released from Stillwater Prison. Mary Johnson organized a homecoming party for him, inviting Catholic nuns from the neighborhood, former gang members from Chicago who had heard about what was happening and driven north to witness it, and friends and supporters who wanted to celebrate this impossible thing that was unfolding. Ashia stood in that room surrounded by people who should have been his enemies, who should have hated him, and instead they were welcoming him home. Mary introduced him to her landlord, and when Ashia mentioned needing a place to live, the landlord, with Mary's blessing, offered him the apartment right next door to hers. It was an arrangement that would have seemed absurd, cruel even, to anyone who did not understand what had passed between them, but it was not absurd. It was precisely right. Ashia moved into the apartment next to Mary's in the North Side community of Minneapolis. And they became more than friends, they became family. Mary called him her spiritual son, and Ashia called her his second mother. And they meant it with a depth that transcended the horror of how they had met. They ran into each other constantly, leaving and entering their apartments. And their conversations sounded like any mother and son. Boy, how come you ain't called over here to check on me in a couple days? Or, you ain't even asked me if I need my garbage to go out. They laughed together. They prayed together. They traveled across the country sharing their story at prisons, churches, conferences, anywhere people would listen, because they knew their story was bigger than just them. It was proof that grace could reach places logic said were unreachable. For Mary, forgiveness she had given Ashia was not about diminishing what he had done. Her son was still dead. That fact remained unchangeable, a wound that would never fully heal in this lifetime. But unforgiveness, she told people everywhere she spoke, was like cancer eating you from the inside out. It's not about the other person, she would say, her voice firm with conviction. Me forgiving him does not diminish what he's done. Yes, he murdered my son, but the forgiveness is for me. It's for me. She had learned that carrying hatred was not loyalty to Laramian's memory, but poison to her own soul. And by setting Ashia free from her rage, she had set herself free as well. She got to watch him graduate from college, something she had never gotten to see Laramian do. She got to witness him become a man who contributed to society, who spoke against violence, who proved that redemption was more than just a word. Ashia struggled with forgiving himself, even as he learned to accept Mary's forgiveness. I haven't totally forgiven myself yet, he admitted in interviews, his voice heavy with the weight he would always carry. It's something I'm learning from you. I won't say that I have learned yet, because it's still a process that I'm going through. He went to work at a recycling plant during the day and took college classes at night, determined to prove himself worthy of the mercy he had been given. He spoke at prisons, sharing his story with other young men who were walking the path he had walked, telling them that unforgiveness and resentment were debts that would eventually come due in violence. He told them about collecting baggage, about how the disrespect and slights he had refused to release had grown until they exploded into the worst moment of his life. Years passed, and the story of Mary and Ashia spread around the world. CBS News featured them. The BBC filmed a documentary about their relationship. NPR's StoryCorps recorded their conversation for posterity. The Forgiveness Project held them up as exemplars of what reconciliation could look like when people were willing to do the hard, impossible work of choosing mercy over revenge. Churches invited them to speak. Schools brought them in to talk to students about violence and forgiveness. Everywhere they went, people wept listening to their story, because it challenged every instinct we have about justice and fairness and what we owe to people who have hurt us beyond measure. It was a story that should not have been possible, and yet there they stood, mother and spiritual son, proof that love could reach even into the darkest places. In 2015, Mary married a man named Ed Roy, someone who understood her journey because he had walked a similar path after his own son was murdered. At the wedding, Ashia Israel walked Mary down the aisle, standing in the place her biological son could never stand, and the symbolism of that moment was not lost on anyone present. The man who had taken her son's life was now the one giving her away. And instead of tragedy, it felt like triumph, the triumph of grace over grief, of hope over hatred, of life over death. Ashia became a grandfather of sorts when he had children of his own, and Mary delighted in the role, helping him pick out car seats and offering the kind of parenting advice that only someone who has loved and lost a child can give. The relationship between them was, as Mary often said, beyond belief. It defied every expectation, violated every assumption about how victims and perpetrators should relate to one another. But it was also profoundly simple. It was the story of two people who had been trapped in a prison of pain, one behind bars and one behind the bars of her own bitterness, and who had found the key to freedom in the most unlikely place, in each other. Mary had needed Ashia's genuine remorse and transformation to heal. Ashia had needed Mary's forgiveness to begin the work of forgiving himself. They had needed each other in ways that made sense only to God, only to whatever force in the universe pushes toward redemption, even when we are certain redemption is impossible. When Mary Johnson Roy died in March of 2024 at the age of 71, thousands of people came to mourn her passing. But they came not just to mourn, they came to celebrate what she had taught the world about the power of forgiveness. Ashia Israel stood among the mourners, no longer her son's killer, but her spiritual son, carrying forward the work she had begun. Her granddaughter, Rosalinda, who never got to meet her father because Ashia had killed him 5 months after she was born, pledged to continue spreading her grandmother's message. People do deserve a second chance, Rosalinda said, her voice steady with conviction, born from watching her grandmother live out an impossible grace. You can't always beat down somebody because of a wrong that they did. There is good in people. The legacy Mary left was not one of bitterness or revenge, but of transformation, proof that even the most damaged, broken, impossible relationships could be healed if someone was brave enough to take the first step toward forgiveness. There are moments in human history when ordinary people do extraordinary things. When someone makes a choice so radical, it shifts the foundation of what we think is possible. Mary Johnson made that choice when she walked into Stillwater Prison to face the man who had destroyed her life. She made it again when she hugged him. She made it every single day that she chose to live as if forgiveness was not just a word, but a way of being in the world. Her story is not about excusing violence or minimizing loss. Her son is still gone. That pain still echoes through the years, but her story is about refusing to let violence have the last word, refusing to let hatred consume what was left of her life. It is about understanding that the opposite of murder is not punishment, but but resurrection. The resurrection that happens when we choose to love even when love seems impossible. When we reach across the chasm of our pain and find another human being reaching back. Faith, Mary learned, is not about believing easy things. It is about choosing to trust that there is a path forward even when you cannot see it. That there is healing even when the wound feels mortal. That there is light even in the deepest darkness. It is about being willing to be transformed, to let God change your heart in ways that terrify you. To step into the unknown with nothing but the whisper of grace to guide you. Mary's faith did not erase her pain, but it gave her a way to carry it that did not destroy her. It taught her that forgiveness was not a feeling but a decision. One she had to make over and over, a practice rather than a destination. And in practicing forgiveness, she found freedom, not freedom from grief, but freedom within it, the freedom to live fully even after loss, to love even after betrayal, to hope even when hope seemed foolish. The story of Mary Johnson and Ashia Israel will endure because it speaks to something fundamental in the human experience. Our need to believe that people can change, that relationships can heal, that the worst things we have done do not have to define us forever. It is a story that offers no easy answers, that does not minimize the cost of violence or the reality of loss. But it insists that there is another way, a harder way. A way that runs straight through the fire of our pain towards something that looks like redemption. Mary chose that path not because it was easy, but because staying in hatred was killing her, and she wanted to live. In choosing life, she gave it not just to herself, but to Ashia, and in doing so, she gave all of us permission to believe that our own impossible things might be possible to every time we choose forgiveness over revenge, mercy over justice, hope over despair. We participate in the same miracle Mary experienced in that prison visiting room. We become agents of transformation in a world that needs it desperately. We prove that the love we talk about in churches and songs and prayers is not just theoretical, but practical. Not just aspirational, but achievable. Mary Johnson taught us that the hardest commandment, love your enemies, forgive those who hurt you, is not impossible, but necessary. That it is the only commandment that can break the cycles of violence that trap us all. Her legacy is not that she was perfect, or that forgiveness came easily. Her legacy is that she did the work, took the steps, made the journey from hatred to love, one painful choice at a time, and arrived on the other side, transformed. This account is based on verified reporting by CBS News, NPR, the BBC, and the Forgiveness Project, where Mary Johnson and Ashia Israel shared their story publicly for years. The facts of Laramian Bird's murder on February 12, 1993. Ashia Israel's conviction and 17-year imprisonment, Mary's prison visit in 2005, and their subsequent reconciliation have been documented by multiple credible news organizations. Their relationship, including Ashia moving next door to Mary after his 2010 release and the two traveling nationally to speak about forgiveness and redemption, was widely reported and celebrated as one of the most powerful modern testimonies of Christian forgiveness in action. Mary's death in March 2024 was mourned by thousands who had been touched by her message that unforgiveness is like cancer, and that choosing mercy can set us free.